Welcome to the meeting number 24 of the Standing Committee on Official Languages. In accordance with Article 103(3)(f) and the referral order of Tuesday, December the 9th, 2025, we are continuing our study on the official languages regulations, progressing towards equality of status and the use of French and English. I would now like to welcome our witnesses from Société en Français, Santé en Français. We have Antoine Desilets, General Manager. Welcome. And on a personal level, we also have Rémi Légier, a tenured professor. Welcome. You will each have 5 minutes to deliver your opening remarks. After that, Mr. Godin. I have a few questions, Mr. Chair, to understand things. I would like some information, please. In the official gazette, there was an article. I know you won't have the answer, but could you give the instruction to the registrar to get the answer? In the gazette, there was the appearance or the publishing of number 4, pecuniary administrative sanctions. And some information differs in the introduction or the explanation of the event. We had fines of type C identified from 10,000 to 50,000, but in the regulations it's 5,000 to 50,000. That's just an example of information that differs. I don't really understand that the regulations have changed throughout in the consultation process and things have been corrected. Maybe that's the intention of the department, but I just want to understand at this stage whether that's a normal way of doing things or whether they are typos in the official gazette, the official journal. Is it possible for you to ask the registrar, please, to check to see whether these are in line with the procedures?
There's
a misunderstanding that so the understanding is that the letter will be sent this week. There should be a clarification letter sent this week, and you'll have to send it to the registrar. It will be sent to the registrar. Now, what I would like is for the registrar to carry out the process to obtain this information. If I've understood, I understand what my colleague has just said, but my presentation will be given to the committee. I want to ensure that the information is compliant and sent to the registrar and on track with the procedural guidelines. Thank you for the additional information from my colleague. But if the letter that we are going to be sending to the committee responds to our requirements and needs, that's all very good. But at least the clerk ought to be able to do this and to look at it in more depth. Okay, I will consult with the clerk. Thank you. Just a few moments.
Donc j'ai consulté avec la greffière.
I've just spoken to the clerk. What the clerk can do is inquire with the department and find information to explain why. I haven't actually spotted these differences, and she will find out why there are these differences. And as a committee, we can then move forward with this information and, of course, with the letter that will be sent to the clerk. You understand, Mr. Chair, it's new for all of the parliamentaries to be working with these regulations. Last time, there were regulations for the bill on official languages, but we didn't talk about it here. That was a decision made by the committee, but we've decided to analyze it and improve it. Now, that was my first question. My second question, Mr. Chair, could you please update us on the list of witnesses for the aspect we are dealing with, part 7, if we still have witnesses left, and how many sessions do we have left, please? I would like to have an idea in time and a calendar following the work that was done previously to see if we have space for more witnesses. We had another request. My colleague actually asked if we could add an extra witness. I'm quite happy to do that, but if that is not possible, then I will ask for her testimonial to be used for the permanent of the Standing Senatorial Committee, and that it be added to the testimonies and be taken into consideration during the drafting process. Now, if you've understood, I've understood, and I'll ask the clerk to correct me if I'm wrong. We have today's meeting, which is going to last 2 hours with witnesses. And then we have the Thursday meeting during the first hour, which is also going to have witnesses for part 7, and then that's it for the witnesses. Is it that? And I'm going to ask the clerk, could you give us an update regarding the witnesses for the day of Thursday? I don't think we've sent out the document yet.
So it's
not necessary at this stage. We've abided by the way it was divided between the 3 parties. May I, Mr. Chair, ask the question to my colleagues to give instructions to the clerk? Would my colleagues like to add any witnesses for this part of the regulation number 7? The question is open to my colleagues. Mr. Chair, would you feel that everything is fully covered? Just a few moments before we begin, let me just consult with the clerk. Thank you.
Okay, donc j'ai consulté la greffière.
Okay, I've consulted with the clerk. There are already two witnesses for Thursday. If we don't add any additional meetings, if we only keep this meeting today and the 1-hour meeting on Thursday, we have space for 1 other witness alone. I'm just warning you, there'll be 3 witnesses in the whole committee. At the moment, we have 2. Now, in terms of how they are spread around, so if I've understood correctly, for the moment, if we add no one, we have already come into compliance with the proportion for all parties. If you wish to add someone for Thursday, that would be, my proposal would be that everyone agrees, all parties, and that we were then to add this person. Okay, well, Stéphanie Chouinard, I think that my Liberal colleague on the Liberal side is in agreement with this. There may be a vote if required, but we're going to win with the Liberals, I'm sure.
D'accord? Tout le monde est d'accord?
Does everyone agree? Okay. Well, in that case, we can add this guest. Monsieur Gaudin, any other items you wish to raise? No, absolutely. I hadn't heard from you for a while, actually. We haven't had someone take the floor like that since for a while. Okay, I would like to welcome our witnesses. We may have lost a little amount of time, but you can see that we work very well together collaboratively. You each have 5 minutes to deliver your opening remarks, and then we will move to the questions and answers from the parliamentaries. So, Monsieur Desilets, you have the floor for 5 minutes. Chair, ladies and gentlemen, members of the committee, thank you very much for inviting me to come here today. I'm talking to you in a situation where the Acadian and Francophone communities' expectations are very high. After years of advocacy, the modernization of the Official Languages Act was finally supposed to enable us to progress towards true equality between English and French in Canada. First of all, right from the beginning, I'd like to make it clear that the Société Santé en Français fully supports the recommendations presented by the FCFA of Canada during its appearance before this committee. Let us recall the objective of the regulations. They're tools to equip federal institutions to really implement the objectives of the Act. Good regulations lead to concrete actions. Imprecise regulations leave room for ambiguity, and in practice, on a daily basis, the temptation to take the path of least resistance. I would like to illustrate this with the concrete example in the field of health. In March 2023, the federal government and provinces agreed on bilateral health agreements based on key principles that are clearly defined. And I quote, an equality principle for health services for people and persons seeking equality community, including communities including official language minority communities. This principle appears in black and white in all agreements, and in the field of health, it is rare to see such an explicit consensus between Ottawa and the provinces. However, when we examine the implementation plans for these agreements, developed by the provinces and approved by the federal government, we do see a striking discrepancy. As a majority jurisdictions, or in a vast majority of jurisdictions, this principle does not translate into any concrete measure aimed at improving access to health services in French. The result is simple. The principle exists on paper, but it is not put into operation in public decisions. However, we were in a situation where the Modernized Act provided federal institutions had to take positive measures to support the vitality of their communities and take into account the impacts of their decisions. Yet in this case, this has had very little impact on concrete measures. Billions of dollars in federal funds are transferred to the provinces to improve access to health services without clearly taking into account access to services in French. When the Official Languages Act is not enforced, the federal government unfortunately contributes to widening the gap that already exists between the services offered to the majority and those available to our communities. Let's review the context. We have a modernized act that clarifies the responsibilities of federal institutions towards official language minority communities, and we also had an agreement in principle endorsed by all parties that explicitly recognized these communities. In theory, all conditions were in place for official languages to be taken into account and accounted for, and yet the results are very limited. How can we explain this discrepancy? Well, the hypothesis I am putting forward is simple. The path of least resistance prevails. In complex negotiations with the provinces, language obligations are set aside. This brings us to a fundamental question. What is the value of a principle and a law if it does not lead to concrete decisions? When I read the draft regulations, which are supposed to provide federal institutions with the tools to enforce the Act, another question comes to mind. If these regulations had been in force, would they have prevented this gap between principles and actions in health agreements? After reading the proposed text, my answer is no. The regulations do not really equip federal institutions to ensure that their obligations are met in complex cases, such as intergovernmental agreements. Several key elements are lacking clarity: the definition of positive measures, the analyses that institutions must conduct, consultations with communities, mechanisms for measuring progress towards substantive equality. Finally, and this is particularly important, the regulations should specify that language obligations and duties must be considered at all stages of the negotiating agreements with the provinces and territories. In other words, the regulations should equip federal institutions in order to act not only when it is easy, but especially when it is difficult. I'm turning to you, members of the committee, you who devote so many hours to studying our official languages. If, same as me, your goal is to ensure that concrete improvements in the situation of official language communities in Canada improves, then the currently proposed regulations are insufficient. Francophone and Acadian communities have taken part in over a decade to the work that has led to the modernization of the Act. They are now expecting the spirit of this Act to be translated into reality. Without clearer and more robust regulations, the modernization of the Act risks, at least in the field of health, to remain for a great part without concrete impact. Thank you very much for your attention. Oh, perfect. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand the floor now to Monsieur Léger. You have 5 minutes. Mr. Chair, honourable members, I'm a professor of political science at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia. I've been working on Canadian language policies for some 15 years, particularly the role of Canadian Francophone organizations in the development, revision, and review and implementation of these policies. My presentation today will be divided into 3 parts. First of all, the regulations on Part 7 is an essential part of the modernization of the Official Languages Act. It must translate in concrete terms the legislator's intentions and make the commitments that are made fully operational. Without robust regulations, modernization that began in 2018 will unfortunately remain incomplete. By definition, regulations serve to clarify a law and guide its concrete application. Every law sets out principles or makes general commitments. For example, Section 41(1) of Part 7 requires the federal government to, and I quote, promote the vitality and support the development of official language minorities. There are several ways to implement these commitments. The question is therefore which one to choose and why, for what reasons, what factors should guide this decision, what conditions must be met, and what role should minority organizations play in decision making, simply being consulted or actively participating in the development and the implementation of the aforesaid programs. Finally, once a decision has been made, what mechanisms will be used to assess its impact on progress substantive equality? A regulation is like a way of providing an answer, a toolbox for the law. Its primary function is to equip civil servants and stakeholders, as my colleague said, responsible for implementing a law. And we could say that that it really is a toolbox for the law. Secondly, if an implementing regulation is to serve as a tool for civil servants and stakeholders, we must conclude that the current draft is a very poor tool. Why? Well, because it essentially just repeats the act word for word. The few clarifications it adds, let's face it, are obvious. And I will come back to this in a few moments. It does not say anything, absolutely nothing, about the guiding principle of Part 7 or even of the OLA as a whole, which is progressing towards substantive equality. Allow me now to give you an example in order to illustrate this trend by simply reproduce the law. Section 41(7)(b) requires institutions to conduct analyses to determine, and I quote, the possibilities for avoiding or at the very least mitigating the direct negative impacts that their structural decisions might have on the commitments set out in paragraphs 1 to 3, end of quote. The regulation is an opportunity to clarify the factors used to assess whether or not a decision has positive or negative impacts. It is also an opportunity to clearly define what a policy decision actually is. The only information on this provided by the regulation is that the analysis has to assess whether the whether official language minorities are affected by the structural decision. And it's obvious to assess whether or not this is the case. Apart from this, there is no highlighting in the regulation on this precise example of 41(7)(b). One could carry out a similar analysis of most of the rest of the draft bill. Thirdly, and lastly, the Modernized Act marks a paradigm shift. The progression towards substantive equality becomes a centerpiece, the guiding principle of the OLA. However, this very concept of substantive equality is absent from the draft regulation, yet it should be the backbone of this regulation. If the primary function of a regulation is to provide civil servants with the tools in order to implement a law, and if that law has as a substantive equality as its guiding principle, one could expect to see the regulation clarifying what substantive equality is and providing a methodology and tools in order to assess whether decisions and measures taken effectively contribute towards it. As a conclusion, I ask the committee to ask the Treasury Board to look at its work whilst reminding it, and this is important, the attention of the lawmaker during the modernizing of the law in 2023. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Monsieur Léger. And we're now going to hand the floor to the deputies, the parliamentaries.
Intéressant.
Thank you very much for being here. It's always interesting to hear from you and to have you here in person. I will start with Mr. Desilets. Mr. Desilets, what you said in your introduction was, in theory, everything looks and sounds good. But in practice, there's nothing tangible. There are no tools. Can you help us in identifying the very specific elements that we can insert in the draft regulation? And like Mr. Léger, the smartest path forward is perhaps to ask the Treasury Board to go back to the drawing board. So I'd like to hear from you on that, Mr. Desilets. Well, I tend to respect expertise and experience, that of my colleague, Mr. Léger. I was mentioning that for me, bilateral agreements, well, there's a situation where there were no regulations, but we had the act that came out, and on paper, there was a tacit agreement between Ottawa and the provinces to take into account official language minority communities. And in practice, it doesn't really translate. In Alberta, for example, they managed to put funds directly into communities. You're asking me what could be put in a regulation. Well, I think we can take inspiration from the Alberta situation, see what's working. There's a Pareto principle that's applied, so there are bilateral agreements. The province agreed to collaborate directly with Francophone groups for the implementation of health services following a request by the province. Then, in the bilateral agreements, the province estimated the amounts available for Francophone activities, and they included it in their action plan. Those for me are examples of positive measures. That is to say, collaboration with organizations that represent Francophone communities, and, along with the lines of this, nothing for me without me. Now, the question is, what can be done with the regulation? Does it get returned to the Treasury Board? Well, I think that there are some major holes in the current draft regulations that are being proposed. I don't think the regulation will change the situation that I described in my opening remarks. So I don't think that the regulation goes far enough to clarify certain things. As recently as today, I was told, well, there's no obligations in the around official languages in the provinces with this regulation. And I agree. The federal government has a responsibility to implement the act. There is a significant gap between taking necessary measures and announcing them. So the public service is not acting on this front. And that's where the regulation could be more precise and say what could be done. These are not obligations currently. So it's a lot more concrete. That would be a lot more tools in the toolbox. Yes, that's just it. And we'd have to specify at what point an analysis needs to be done for official languages, for example. This would be part of negotiating a new agreement, the bilateral agreement is only one of many in Canada. And it would also be an analysis during the process, and then there'd be analysis after the process. Ultimately, without tools like this, we talked about a toolbox. Well, the natural tendency is to go toward the path of least resistance, and that does not help Francophone communities to go towards a more vitality. Mr. Desiree, I heard you say that we shouldn't act only when it's easy and convenient to do so. A regulation is a lot more, has to be applied when the situation is difficult rather. That's when we really have to go back to it. On the day-to-day basis, well, if things are fluid, we don't have to turn to the regulations, but we do when we're in more specific circumstances. So I'm hearing you saying you need indicators, you need assessments, you need an analysis at the beginning, during, and at the end. And yet you don't find that in the regulation. No, not currently. That's correct. So that's something that would be very important to have written out very clearly in the regulation to equip you. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I do want to make sure that I've understood properly. Yes, you've understood properly. I've named the impact assessments as one of the measures. That's a positive measure to implement. That should be part of the regulation. It doesn't happen naturally unless it's requested. It's already in the act and yet it's not being done. So how do you make sure it's done? Well, you make a more robust and clear regulation that leaves no room for ambiguity or no room for think people who don't want to do it because it's not practical. Thank you very much. Over to Mr. Léger now. You spoke about the principle or the notion of advancing equality towards substantive equality. You're saying that concretely in the regulation, there's nothing that's there to help you to reach this objective and to uphold that notion. There are 30 seconds left. In my opinion, this is the ultimate objective of the Modernized Act. It's the advancement that we made from the 1988 Act and the 2023 Act. Right now, the centerpiece of the bill is moving towards substantive equality. So that's the guiding principle. And in your opinion, well, and that's absent from the regulation, as far as I can tell. That's a total failure. This new ambition in the act needs to be now implemented. Now, how could we improve the regulation? Very quick response, please, because the time is up. Well, very quickly, I think there has to be an introduction, a purpose at the beginning of the regulation that announces this new vision that is part of substantive equality and advancement towards that substantive equality, and then how it happens thanks to tools that are laid out in the regulation. Thank you. Mr. Villeneuve, 6 minutes.
Merci, bienvenue,
Thank you very much. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you for being here and contributing to our work. It's very important. My first question is for Mr. Desilets. For the sector that you represent, Mr. Desilets, what is the importance of a regulation that ensures a robust implementation of Part 7 of the Official Languages Act, given that health falls under provincial jurisdiction? How can this really contribute in a material way? Yes, indeed. This is, well, the administration of health services, of course, fall under the provinces, 100%. Now, when we're talking about official languages, how can the federal government fulfill its own responsibilities around official languages? The federal government each year sends about $55 to $65 billion to the healthcare system in the provinces through the transfers, and that's not even taking into account the other transfers. Those are huge amounts, almost $60 billion of federal investment in the healthcare system. And so the entirety of that amount is not subject to the Official Languages Act. There are some bilateral agreements, according to my reading of the Act, should consider language clauses, or like the Act says, there should be work to take necessary measures to include these. It doesn't mean to require the provinces, but it does mean something. But I don't have clarity on what was done so far to encourage the inclusion of these language clauses. If it is done, well, it's certainly not visible to the Francophone community. In my opinion, I think there needs to be an honest negotiation with the federal government on matters that affect official languages when it comes to healthcare. Bilateral agreements are one of these rare moments when we can take action. We've got an agreement in principle. There's the transfers, yes, but all provinces have accepted the principles that include equal access by official language communities. The act exists, but there's no real impact. So this has to be enabled. It has to be very clear when negotiating. What does it mean when we say, encouraging or cultivating? For example, is the other party named? Who has to be negotiated with? Were there impacts that were shared, or when there was nothing, what was the response to a plan that was submitted? Even if it was already written in the basic principles. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to go over to Mr. Léger now. Mr. Léger. The Act lays out that the federal government commits to promote French as part of its diplomatic activities. Now, the draft does not specify how this commitment should unfold and what follow-up or accountability mechanisms should be in place. So in your opinion, would it have been relevant to be specific about, follow-up requirements and so on? What would you say to that? Thank you very much. This is something that's very unique to the draft regulation. The new Part 7 in the Modernized Act is considerably more thorough compared to that of 1988. But there are just a few specific sections in Section 7. Those are 7 to 10. So parts 1 to 6 are absent from the regulation. And so scientific diplomacy is in 42. In any case, it's later. And it wasn't dealt with either. So there's Section 7 that's quite complete, and we talk about substantive equality, and there is a regulation that targets this, is trying to target specific sections of Part 7. And that seems to be a mistake, in my opinion, quite honestly. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Vous choisirez qui va répondre à cette question.
Well, listen, you can choose who will answer this next question. I think I have 1 minute and 50 seconds. 2 minutes? Thank you. That's kind of you. We often hear that some departments are awaiting the implementation of regulations before they take action on their requirements around Section 7, even though Section 7 of the Modernized Act has been in effect since receiving royal assent. Tell us, is the responsibility in fact Is it the department's responsibility or the Treasury Board Secretariat's responsibility? Either of you. Yes, you've described the situation well. The Act has been in effect since June 2023. I don't collaborate with all federal institutions. I'm very much working closer with Health Canada. I've seen Health Canada become a leader on this and look into sections that weren't so clear in the Act. For example, when it comes to constructive measures, they've come up with internal definitions of what that could mean. Ultimately, well, this leaves things open to interpretation, even if they've been a good leader on certain things. And I'll give you an example. Taking measures to encourage versus requiring, there's still, incomprehension around this. We need a regulation so that everybody has the same understanding. Everybody is currently trying to figure out how they can fulfill their obligations, and it's a little confusing. I think that there are obligations that aren't being upheld in the Act currently, but there's also the context. There's the connection with the Treasury Board, which is quite complex. It's not a new institution, but has a new role when it comes to official languages. I think there are a lot of reasons why things are kind of stagnating. Pardon me. No, that's good. Have you finished? Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Villeneuve. Now over to Mr. Beaulieu for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, to start. Mr. Léger, you're saying that the main concept is substantive equality and advancement towards that, and you're saying it's not clearly defined in the regulation. What would your definition be of advancement towards substantive equality? Well, advancement towards substantive equality is recognizing the reality of official language minority communities, OLMCs. 41.1 recognizes the plurality and the uniqueness of these communities. And so it's to listen to these communities and their reality, listen to their needs and priorities. In the end, this means asymmetrical approaches, so different approaches. Perhaps certain things will be done for the Franco-Albertan community compared to what's done for the Franco-Manitoban community. But the idea is to listen to the needs and priorities of these communities in order to contribute to equality on the ground between both languages. So the objective is to have access in education in French, for example. That access should be equivalent to access to education in English and so on. Does that fit into your definition? Well, when it comes to education, yes, also in healthcare, employment, immigration, in all sectors. Okay, perfect. Mr. Desire, in the healthcare system. Are there efficient instruments being used currently to take stock of the situation so we know what we want to head towards? Well, I'll interpret what you mean by take stock of things. I mean, we can talk about substantive equality. There's a lot of data that's missing in the healthcare sector, especially when it comes to the official languages. So when we talk about tools in the toolbox, first of all, we have to make sure that federal institutions are gathering all data while considering official languages. And then, of course, there's the official language minority communities. There's the language, the French language, but then there's the minority experience as well. For example, in Quebec, there's a study that showed that 37% of nurses regularly use English or more often use English, and then 51% for doctors, and more so in Montreal. What would you say to those? Sorry, which one are you referring to? Was this Statistics Canada in 2025? There was a study on healthcare, and there is a significant gap between the Anglo-Quebecers and the Francophones. We estimate, well, Health Canada thinks that 55,000 healthcare workers outside of Quebec speak French. There are people who use the language. Of course, there's some nuances, but approximately, I'm just, off the top of my head, if 25% of doctors outside of Quebec speak French, only about 10% of them actually use it. So there's really a gap here. When we talk about positive measures, enabling people who have French, it's about actually using it. when we talk about on the ground, even in Ontario, aside from, the Montfort Hospital or some places, it's very difficult to get health care services in French. It's quite, we see that, yes, it's very widespread, and it's not because there's a lack of professionals. We've got, let's say, 20% of the population that's French. Well, you might have about 20% of those at the hospital who also speak French. So it's about, matching people up, the skills of the workers and then the needs of the people. So there needs to be a pairing up system. And that is up to the province when it comes to healthcare. We're talking about organizing healthcare services. But a measure that the federal government could support, for example, well, in the series of data that is being requested, well, to get our hands on data that has to do with healthcare, that's not in the agreements currently, but that could help. And out of the measures, supporting healthcare services in French outside of Quebec, in Quebec, even the government of Quebec, it gives money to groups who advocate for more healthcare services in English. The federal government gives quite a bit of money too, about $10 million per year. Would that be a good measure? And to what extent is that the case currently in healthcare in French outside of Quebec? That's a very good question. How much money would be required? We don't even know what the current impact is for professionals who are outside of Quebec right now. We've got there's a lot of, in fact, it's very difficult to know. And I wondered the same thing. There are a number of Outaouais doctors who crossed over. Does that have an impact on healthcare services in French in Ontario? I don't know, because data doesn't exist around that. There's no connection. People are assigned randomly. So the real impact is hard to measure. Quebec has good measures in many cases, although I don't want to, say too much about that. But ultimately, when it comes to the federal government, it's within their power to gather data, provide tools, and that can be public health data or the services, the number of family doctors, all of that should be broken down and offered. Now, when it comes to promoting English, Mr. Beaulieu, your time is up.
Mr.
Thank you.
Beaulieu, your time is up. Thank you very much. So, colleagues, we're now going to the second round of questions. We still have 20 minutes. And in order to finish this round of questionings, I will have to shorten just a little bit your time for questions. So the Conservatives and the Liberals will have 4 minutes instead of 5. Mr. Beaulieu, you will get 2 minutes instead of 2.5. And even there, I'm still going to have to be very strict with the time. So Mr. Dalton, 4 minutes, please. Thank you very much to all witnesses for appearing here this afternoon. It's I'm very happy to see you both, Mr. Léger. Like I said before, I used to go to Simon Fraser, and when I was a student, I went to one of your, if I were a student right now, I would go to one of your classes. And I think Simon Fraser University is just the most beautiful university in all of Canada. I'll start here with Mr. Desilets. We are going to be looking at things and make a report. So you have said several things, and you didn't mince your words. You said that there's a lack of clarity, that it's not enough. You've said that there are some concrete steps that are missing. Do you think that this is a failure? Do you think that the rules here are in a failure? Just to me understand, do you think that such as things have been presented as a failure? I think it needs some work. I wouldn't call it a failure, but there are many recommendations on the part of Francophone communities that had been communicated during the consultations, which are not found there. So is it enough? No. Is it a failure? I don't know. I thought the words might be a bit strong. Well, I am in the opposition, don't forget.
Donc, je trouve un peu qu'on a entendu.
I found that we have heard that it was good, but it lacks teeth in order to carry out concrete actions. Mr. Léger, you have said that the regulations have to show how the law works and also evaluate whether it what it does to minorities. I'm trying to find the words. This would be the proof of how it works. And it appears to me that you feel that this isn't the case, that this is not going to have the desired impact, and it won't have the desired impact on the Francophone communities. Is that correct? Basically, I think that this new project is ambitious, but the other one lacks ambition. So I congratulate the work that your committee has undertaken, because you were very ambitious in part 7. But I am sad that we are not being given the means in order to concretize these new commitments made under part 7. Why is that the case? Why does it lack teeth? Could you give us a few words on this, Mr. Disley? What is the main reason? Well, I like images, but I see a funnel. You know, we start with the top of the funnel and then we go, you know, to directives and guidelines. But right now we're still within regulations. And within a regulation, you have to give people the tools and the means in order to enforce the guiding principles that make up a law. And right now, the state of things is that in this draft, we're just not there.
Monsieur Desilets aussi, si vous voulez commentaire là.
And Mr. Desilets as well. Yes, yes. I like this expression of this lack of ambition, because I think it seems to be very difficult to apply a linguistic lens during difficulties. So for instance, an example would be different kinds of accords with provinces. So I feel that there's a lack of understanding. Thank you. I will give the floor to Mr. Deschênes-Thériault, 4 minutes. So to talk about health, the law talks about taking necessary measures and inclusion on linguistic obligations, and the rule says we have to do what is necessary to inform all parties and include linguistic clauses. What was the maximum interpretation that we can give to necessary measures? Well, that's a good question. Inform, of course, that's obvious. I don't even know if these elements have been applied yet, but it's a good beginning. And I think that we also have to make sure that there's an analysis at the end to see if negotiations truly led to impact. And I think you'd have to include an impact analysis. So in the case of Alberta, so there's a agreement in principle with linguistic lenses and with for the Franco-Albertan community. So how would we inform other provinces using the Alberta example? It's a good example, and I think that they have really, the Franco-Albertan community really was able to stress the importance of what they needed. And I think that this can inform us on the kind of positive impact that we can have, and the kind of collaboration that we can have. And this is visible in the bilateral agreement with Alberta, because if we're not specific about things, we lose them. And it's not just enough to say, oh, we want bilingual human resources. And very often when things get difficult, those things are set aside. Thank you, Mr. Léger. When it comes to implement, we've said that I would like to understand what you mean by this. What do you mean? And how can we talk about accountability? Are you talking about 4110? Well, I'm talking about the enforcement of the accountability regarding the law. Well, there could be indications, criteria. There could be a template, a model.
De règlement.
I think that the draft regulation doesn't go further than the law. And it's good that they insist on evaluation and on surveillance. And the next part is making evaluations of the impact. Did we have the impact that was desired? Were the measures taken positive measures? You've also talked about the guiding principle, looking at substantive equality. And the situation between French and English, as you said, is asymmetrical, and French minority in Canada. So more promotion might be necessary. So you've already said that there is a specific status for French, but maybe not reflected in the rule. And how could we better reflect it for the legislator in order to make it more operational? It's a good question. I think that the progression towards true substantive equality go hand in hand, and we have to look. We have to understand that French is more vulnerable than the other official language, and it needs a little bit of extra help. And I think that that message in Part 7 must be part of the regulation, and the reason for the regulation should be emphasized as to progression towards substantive equality, treatment according to realities and needs, and recognizing that French might need a little extra help. I must interrupt you. I'm very sorry, Mr. Léger. I'm now giving the floor to Mr. Beaulieu, 2 minutes. Thank you very much. Okay, so when we look at, so people saying the rule here is not very satisfactory, the regulation, and some people say we should be started right from the beginning. And we have spoken to Treasury Board, and they have said that they were going to do a follow-up consultation. Do you think that this might yield something that could be more satisfactory? I have no guarantees on success on these issues, but of course, if there are any opportunities to improve things, of course, we will be sitting around the table if you ask us to be there. But if they need more consultation or to clarify things, of course, but no guarantees of success, but we will be there, whatever the case. So for Francophones outside of Quebec, I think it's really important to be forceful if we want things to change. Because the OLA has existed now for 55 years, and French is declining. So in the new law, we've talked about re-establishment of the democratic wave. We've talked a lot about French language immigration. Do you think that that is enough? Because if we increase French-speaking immigrants, would that be an improvement or a temporary improvement? You have about 20 seconds to answer. I don't know if the regulation could counter assimilation. That's another dynamic altogether. But I think that we need to do much more than what we're doing presently. Otherwise, the ambitions of Part 7 will not come to fruition. Thank you very much, both of you. I'm now going to the floor is now to Mr. Bélanger, 4 minutes. Thank you to both witnesses. And I can see that the intent of the modernization of the OLA is very important. I think it's also very important to stave the decline of the French language because there's an inequality. I heard the expression substantive equality. Does that perhaps have different definitions? So if we have a law and we talk about substantive equality, what does that mean from one region to another? Is that a percentage of Francophones or of Francophone minorities in different places? What does it mean? Well, briefly, I could say that equality, formal equality, is the same treatment compared to substantive equality, which is different treatment. And when we talk about different treatment, it means that we have to listen to what the needs and priorities and the realities of the particular minority are and try to respond to this and try to reduce the gap that exists between the minority and the majority. So substantive equality. And do you think it's realistic to think about substantive equality? Well, I think the Parliament certainly seems to think so. So I certainly hope so.
Dans ma région, j'ai
But to enforce, not enforce, in my region, for instance, I have a percentage of, at the most, 20% francophones. But if I go to the hospital to see a doctor, for instance, I'll see lots of documentation both in French and in English. But if the doctor speaks to me, he's not going to speak to me in French. So for us, most of us who are francophones are bilingual. So it's much easier for us to speak in English than not. And then it becomes an issue of,
certain qu'on
as a francophone, should we be playing a bigger role to make sure that we have services in our communities so that we can have true substantive equality in our communities? Research has shown that we might be bilingual in real life, but when we're sick, it's a different story. And with age as well. So very often people who've been bilingual their whole lives find themselves in difficulties with age or illness. Now, then we have the word equity. Equity means measures that might be different from one place to another to make sure we advance. Now, equality can be a long-term objective, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. The legislature was very clear when the act was unanimously or almost adopted, and we have to give ourselves the means to be able to reach these goals. So if the law is not applicable, well, it's a tautology. We have to break this cycle. There are ways that we can truly get the public service to set this in motion.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Giving my time to my colleague. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to ask a substantive question. We legislators, and we thank you, and thank you for saying that we did a good job. But this bill is very ambitious, bold. Now, within Treasury Board, the rules are being written, and the rules must have as a goal the principles held in the law. So do you think that the Treasury Board is open to reviewing those rules and regulations and go back to the drawing board? So one sentence each, because our time is up. To me, the Treasury Board has to set in motion what the intentions of the legislators actually were. Thank you for being so concise. I'm giving the floor to Madame Chanette, 4 minutes. Thank you, gentlemen, experts, for being with us today. I'm trying to find concrete solutions because we can improve things. And so I'm looking for specific things. So among the things we've heard, we've talked about comparative analysis between the Sect Plus. Do you know this analysis? So I'll try and so knowing that we already have data in order to carry out this data and intersectionality and language were there. But unless we use the toolbox, we need to reinforce the L in this toolbox. Is that a concrete way of proceeding? Yes. If there's political will in order to, we know that GBA Plus was used and it would have, of course, be not the language analysis was done. Yes. Yes, there's even work that has been done by researchers, what we call EDF, Analyse Francophone, at the University of Ottawa, which also could be potentially quite useful. So we could say that data is important, and there is already a toolbox within Treasury Board that can be reinforced. Yes. The other thing that I heard you say is you talked about what we call the vitality, the promotion of vitality. So it doesn't affect all ministries or all departments, but the challenge is to make sure that everybody thinks about it. So we have to do things stage by stage. So is that promotion of vitality a basic tool, but at the same time that thinking that all new important program needs to be analyzed through this. So in other words, we'd have to do everything this way and do it step by step. And if we need analysis, we will be able to step by step improve the departments and their priorities. I agree with this pragmatic idea of going step by step, but this law has actually been in existence for the last 2.5 years. So I think that we really need to start somewhere. I don't accept that we are so behind with everything that's going on. But yes, we can't go back. But there are things that are moving far too slowly. So could we at least say that all new initiatives must use comparative analysis between the various areas and look at all of the priorities and have instead of a series of criterias? Because criterias, well, that's going to become extremely bureaucratic if we use that. So what do you think, Mr. Léger? I think we missed an opportunity, or Treasury Board missed an opportunity of something that already works in the public service. You've named a few. So there is a lens of official languages that was used by EDSC in 2020. There's a document in 2022 by PCH on the use of French language in federal and provinces. And then there's Treasury Board itself in 2017 presented an analysis for substantive equality. So there are already tools that exist within Treasury Board to do this. And I think it would be an important idea to curate all of these different tools and look at things this way. You have 10 seconds.
Tous, mais
Which one would be the most relevant to explore? All of them. The thing with these analyses, the Treasury Board had prepared this in 2017, and yet no elements. There are specific indicators
Merci.
that are in the draft regulations that were within the same department. Thank you. Thank you very much. On behalf of our colleagues, I'd like to thank our witnesses for having been here with us today. Colleagues, I'm just going to suspend for a moment so we can change and move on to the next panel of witnesses. The meeting is suspended. colleagues, welcome back to the 24th meeting of the Standing Committee on Official Languages. We will now proceed with our second panel. I would like to welcome our witnesses. From the Fédération Culturelle Canadienne-Française, we have Nancy Junot, President, appearing by video conference. Welcome. Hello. Manon-Henri Cadieux, Director, Strategy and Government Relations. Hello. Gabrielle Poliquin, Legal Advisor. Welcome. And from the Fédération des Associations de Juristes d'Expression Française de Common Law, we have Rénal Rémillard, Executive Director, also appearing by video conference. Welcome, Mr. Rémillard. Hello. Each organization will have 5 minutes to deliver their opening remarks, and then we'll move on to MP's questions. Ms. Junot, you have the floor for 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Ladies and gentlemen of the chair, I am the proud president of the Fédération Culturelle Canadienne-Française, also known as the FCCF. And as you said, I am here with our Director of Strategy and Government Relations, Manon-Henri Cadieux, and Gabrielle Poliquin, a lawyer specializing in linguistic minority rights. The FCCF has been the voice of the arts and culture sector in Francophone and Acadian communities in minority situations for nearly 50 years. Our network includes 22 national, provincial, and territorial organizations, and through them we represent an ecosystem of more than 300 organizations throughout the country. Our goal today is to contribute to your reflection on issues specific to the arts and culture sector. I would like to start by pointing out that thanks to your contribution to the modernization of the Official Languages Act, OLA, in 2023, our sector is formally recognized as essential to the development and vitality of official language minority communities, OLMCs. The FCCF's position is unequivocal. The draft regulations on Part 7 proposed by the Treasury Board Secretariat must absolutely be revised to reflect the intent of the legislature when it modernized the Official Languages Act. Regulations are intended to clarify the terms and conditions of enforcement or to provide guidelines for the implementation of the law. However, in its current form, the draft regulations offer so little clarity regarding the terms and conditions for the enforcement of federal institutions' obligations that they can only contravene the intention of the legislator who was keen to strengthen these obligations. The FCCF would now like to bring 2 recommendations to your attention. And this is for the draft regulations for Part 7, and I'll hand it over to Manon-Henri Cadieux to present these recommendations. Thank you very much, Nancy. Mr. Chair, ladies and gentlemen of the committee, we recommend first that the regulations set out implementation procedures for taking positive measures, particularly with regard to the obligation of federal institutions to conduct analyses related to their mandate. We note a significant lack of precision in the draft regulations regarding how institutions should conduct these analyses. These analyses are intended to base their positive measures, among other things, and to the extent possible, on research and evidence. This issue is of particular concern to us given the limited data available. Our extensive experience has taught us that the regulation must stipulate 2 things. First, it must specify that relevant data available to federal institutions must be shared with OLMCs at a preliminary stage of their analyses. Second, it must indicate that institutions have an obligation to contribute to the production of data if it does not exist. This could mean producing the data themselves or supporting its production by OLMC representatives, for example, by funding research activities. Second, we recommend that the regulations expand their principles of procedural fairness in terms of the procedures for conducting dialogue and consultation activities with OLMCs. The OLA, Official Languages Act, now recognizes that OLMCs have distinct realities that give rise to their own specific needs. The regulations under Part 7 must reflect this recognition and define an appropriate methodology for conducting dialogue and consultation activities. On this point, a differentiated analysis based on language or the application of a linguistic lens would be appropriate, particularly in the recognized context of the decline of French in North America. There are many models of good consultation practices that the Treasury Board Secretariat could draw on to improve the regulations from a procedural fairness perspective. To give just one example, we believe it is absolutely essential that the regulations require federal institutions to justify why and how they have or have not taken into account the opinions of the OLMCs, particularly when taking positive measures and making structural decisions. Nancy, in conclusion, the FCCF reiterates that the draft regulation for Part 7 must be reviewed by the Treasury Board Secretariat. Without clear definitions and guidelines, it is likely to codify arbitrariness and have the opposite effect of what is expected of a regulation that must embody the ambition of the reinforced Part 7. Thank you for your attention. We are now ready to answer your questions. Thank you very much, Ms. Junot, and I'll hand it over now to Mr. Rémillard for 5 minutes. Yes, thank you. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rénal Rémillard, and I am the Executive Director of the Federation of French-Speaking Common Law Lawyer Associations, the FAJEF. Mr. Justin Kingston, who is the president of FAJEF, was unfortunately unable to attend today's hearing. As you may already know, FAJEF, as we call my organization, has a mandate to promote access to justice in French in all predominantly English-speaking provinces and territories in Canada. FAJEF brings together French-speaking lawyers associations from 7 provinces, the 4 Western provinces, Ontario, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. And FAJEF also has members, namely Francophone organizations, representing the 3 territories, Newfoundland and Labrador, and Prince Edward Island. We are also a member of the Fédération des Communautés Francophones et Acadiennes du Canada, the FCFA. Before we begin, FAJEF would like to thank you for inviting us here today and for giving us the opportunity to comment on the draft regulations. As a national sectoral organization, in this case representing the justice sector, we are naturally very interested in Part 7 of the Official Languages Act and its implementation. In fact, justice is clearly targeted and even mentioned in Part 7 of the OLA in subparagraph 41(6)(c)(v). Here are 4 preliminary comments. First comment. As an active and full member of the FCFA, the FAJEF shares the concerns raised and supports the suggestions made by the FCFA in its brief on the draft regulations on Part 7 of the Official Languages Act, OLA. This brief was filed in February 2026. In our opinion, the draft regulations are insufficient for the following 3 reasons, and they were raised by the FCFA, namely, the lack of clear mechanisms to better regulate the positive measures and negative impacts mentioned in Part 7. The lack of details and clear guidelines for analyses, consultations, and evidence, including the lack of an obligation for federal institutions to make these analyses and studies public, the lack of evaluation and monitoring mechanisms, including the absence of performance indicators to measure the achievement of the desired results. For example, substantive equality for Francophone minorities and the strengthening of the use of French throughout Canada. Second comment, since the new Official Languages Act came into force, except for a significant increase in the number of consultations by federal institutions, FAJEF has observed little change in the federal government's approach and even less desire to innovate or integrate a differentiated approach between Francophone and Anglophone minorities. Our fear is as follows. Without clear guidelines, details, and directives in a regulation, inertia and the status quo will prevail. A stronger regulation is therefore absolutely essential to ensure the full implementation of Canada's new Official Languages Act. Third comment. The regulations should specify that language clauses or obligations in federal provincial agreements, such as those relating to legal aid, must be taken into account at all stages of the negotiation and renewal of a federal provincial agreement. In this case, the presence or absence of language obligations in federal provincial agreements can have a significant impact on the right of any accused person in Canada to have their criminal trial in the official language of their choice in all provinces and territories. There should also be a transparent accountability mechanism for language issues in federal provincial agreements when they include language obligations. Fourth comment, the opportunity to share our comments and suggestions on a draft regulation for Part 7 of the OLA is excellent. FAGEF would like to see the same approach applied to any future regulations proposed under the Act respecting the use of French in private enterprises under federal jurisdiction. In fact, this Act and its potential impact on access to justice in French, particularly given the key role of banks in the legal system, are of great concern to us. Thank you. I'll be happy to answer any questions you have. And of course, there can be suggestions and examples that we can make as to how the regulation can be improved. I can give you more practical solutions later. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Rémillard. We're now going to move over to questions by MPs. I'll start with Mr. Gaudin for 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Thank you. Just a moment. I'm looking for your name. Mr. Rémillard. Thank you to you and the representatives of the Fédération culturelle canadienne-française. What was the expression that Madam Chair used earlier? It wasn't the OLMCs. There was another acronym. What was it? Well, it must have been that one. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you for being part of this exercise. Something that we're hearing, I've been hearing this from the beginning from stakeholders who've come before the committee to testify on this regulation. It's not strong enough. It's not clearly defined enough. It needs more teeth. We need to return to the drawing board. What I'd like to hear from the Federation, the Fédération culturelle canadienne-française, and you've got Mr. Poliquin here with you. Tell us, in material terms, I agree with my colleague. One can say that, it's not good or look at how to improve it, but how can we improve it? And can you give us some very tangible things that we can insert? Now, of course, you can suggest that. I don't know if the Treasury Board will be as receptive as us, but we'll at least forward the arguments. I'd like to hear Mr. Poliquin on this.
La FCCF en particulier, c'est au niveau des dialogues et des...
I can give you concrete examples. I think that what's interesting is the law says in the mandate, the federal institutions, based on analyses, does this and this. There's the analysis. This research or analysis is founded, this is in paragraph 41.8, on, as far as possible, analysis and research and the result of dialogue and consultations, and also on research and data, verified data. Now, we're making a structural or structuring decision. What do we know what it means? Are we into a dialogue or a consultation process? It's not the same thing. The the preliminary draft regulation is going in the same it's going in the right direction, but it doesn't tell the public servants who have to apply the law whether it's a dialogue or a consultation. Is it research? What is data that proves that it's working? So you're trying to ask us to define the means of consultation or discussing this. It's a difficult concept, and just to play devil's advocate, people from the Treasury Board told us that if it was too detailed, it would be too restrictive. So do you have the same opinion? Well, I do actually. It's partly true. We can't be go into too much detail because this regulation is applicable generally to all federal institutions, but we do need a framework, a more detailed framework to be able to provide instructions for existing programs. Maybe dialogue might be sufficient for that program. If it's a new program or an improved one, well, the challenges are much bigger. Maybe consultation is required. I do have examples such as this to give you. So what you're saying, Monsieur Poulican, is that if we define things too deeply, it's going to be restrictive, but with what we have in terms of documents, well, is too general and too vague and permissive for the moment. Well, it's the same as what, as when our chair was saying this, with Madame Junot, federal institutions can choose the method of analysis that they are going to use, and it may not be one that's really perfectly suited to the decisions that have to be made. It needs to be more flexible. Madame Poulican, thank you, and Madame Chair. I'm just going to repeat what you said, and it's music to my ears. You began your opening remarks by saying that the regulation had to absolutely needed to be revised. And I think that what we heard in our agreements on the majority is the same as what you said earlier on. So thank you very much for that comment. Now with Monsieur Rémiard, I'm going to ask a question talking about commentaries and dialogues. Monsieur Rémiard, you said you thought that it was very good that the consultation process for regulation part 7 was, or number 7, was interesting for your organization. Is that what you said? Yes, because it enables us to have a voice and to be heard. We'll see from the results whether that's the case. Yes, well, comments and dialogues are there, but there's no obligation, there's no validation by the Secretary of the Treasury Board. That's slightly bothersome, and that's for all of the people, all of the speakers. But I saw your opening for part 2 on the draft bill for unofficial languages. But what you said is that you're going to be available to come and help us and define regulations for part 2, which is the draft project for the, which is the law on the usage of the language at work. Is that not correct? Yes, it is. So what I'm asking is, in a couple of words, is, and I'm also asking people from French, Canadian culture, do you have another element or an indicator or another word to define this sentence in one sentence? Positive measure is my answer. Thank you very much. I'm going to now hand the floor to Madame Migrelli for 6 minutes. Mr. Chair, thank you very much to all of the witnesses for being here today. I'm going to turn to the witnesses from the FCCF. To begin with, the law on the modernized law, the law on modernized law on languages, it recognized the central role of language in communities in a minority francophone situation. Do you think the law deals with and implements concrete measures within the context of this law for the requirements that it that it asks for? Now, this culture, the word culture, exists in official languages. It's a very striking or marking term, and it is essential and is very much a development for all of our environments. So we would like to give our thanks to all of the lawmakers who included this word, culture, which is very important. Among the comments that we wish to issue, we made comments throughout the process, and we're going to continue with this process during the next stages of the project. We did signify a wish to have a stronger introduction or preamble added to the draft regulation to remind people of the extent of the commitments that were made. And during this conversation, people might say, well, the law exists, it's still in application, but the FCCF has practical experience on this. It co-presides with Canada Heritage for over, and has done for over 25 years. There is an agreement which is collaborative of cultural federal institutions to support our Francophone communities in minority situations. And in the 8th renewal of this agreement in May 2024, we agreed with all of the signatory parties to add a preamble that would remind one of the increased requirements of the modernized law. We've seen the impact of the inclusion of this preamble in the dialogue that we have with the federal institutions at the moment, and we do have this concern. We want to do the same with the reminder of the commitment of the lawmaker, especially in the situation in which things are getting worse, or where and in which, for the moment, the regulation doesn't seem to be addressing an emergency situation, but seems to be diluting the obligations that you're going to be increasing. And from the point of view of culture, is essential. Thank you. Well, you mentioned the strong dependency of the cultural sector in the funding of cultural Canada heritage. What changes ought to be brought to diversify the sources of federal funding for these cultural French-speaking organizations? I believe this is precisely what we have been talking about with this regulation. Draft regulation project, Part 7, is to ensure that all of the federal government's institutions include in it, including the Immigration Ministry, the Ministry for Training, the Ministry in charge of Economic Development, and all of these different departments. We're trying to ensure that these our needs are accounted for. And since we have been appointed and designated as an essential sector, we're still having problems getting through to these departments. And what I see is that the draft resolution, or the preliminary draft regulation, sorry, is a way of encouraging these ministries to do a little more, to join us, to listen to us, and to include us in their programs and in their policies. Thank you. According to you, so should the federal agency have clearer defined duties to support Francophone culture in within their program? Any of you could answer this question? I think the response from SCCF would be yes, but how is this written in the regulation? Well, the regulation which opts for general application, it would say that culture is an essential sector. And how is this translated? Well, in the consultations, the FCCF is an organization that is an expert in culture. The regulation could plan and that when they do a consultation in an essential sector, that they should agree to consult with the right people, not just put out a survey on the internet, but consult with the organizations that are experts in the question itself to get this data that can prove the case, to be able to identify requirements that are specific to the different Francophone communities. 45 seconds left. My last question is for Mr. Riard. During a previous witness statement to the committee, the FAGAF mentioned the requirement to better define duties planned in Part 7 on the law on official languages. According to you, the current regulation, does it fix these duties or these obligations sufficiently well? Well, no, and I'll give you some concrete examples. You have 15 seconds, so maybe a very quick answer. So no, we're lacking a lot of details and steps in order to frame the consultations properly, among other things. Thank you very much. I'm handing the floor now to Mr. Beaulieu for 6 minutes. Fine. Now, during your report and what we have as information, well, you're saying that the cultural sector depends greatly on the funding from Canada Heritage, and that limiting access, and we said this earlier on as well, to has limited access to other department programs. Is this still the case, or do you have any history stories that show a difference in this? Now, during all of the debates on draft bill C13 or C32, culture was mentioned quite a lot, actually, as a response and an answer to support this. We were recognizing the minority situation of French in Quebec and in the North American situation or context. And even these draft bills, it was prevalent, and there were also the articles for to be put into application. And we say that to support the development of Francophone culture in Canada through the activities and organizations that the federal government is responsible for, and ensuring that cultural policies of the federal government reflect the purpose of the law. So it's surprising that we don't get this in the regulation. It doesn't pop up in the regulation. It's a fairly important part. And so even among all of the organizations, the cultural organizations in Canada, the Arts Council, and so on and so forth, there ought to be a duty, an obligation for these positive measures towards culture for Francophones outside of Quebec. It should be integrated into the regulations. And so do you have any specific suggestions on how to do this? Once again, the regulation is to be applied generally, but at the same time, it has to account for the asymmetric nature of French in North America, and also the requirements that are specific to each community. That's written into the law. It has to take into account the requirements for each community. But now, in the regulation, it allows us to do this, to abide by cultural requirements, and that's what I was saying earlier on. It could say that it should have, that it should be prevalent in essential sectors, and that expert institutions ought to be consulted with, and that federal institutions also need to collect data that shows that this is being taken into account in terms of cultural aspects, and to show how this asymmetry is actually happening from a cultural point of view. So what was given to each program and attributed to each program for Francophones or French speakers outside of Quebec? And based on there must be, you must be able to see a net improvement. It's written into the law, and the regulation was supposed to be going further than that, or at least making the law clearer. And I think it's a very interesting point. Also, we talk a great deal about the importance of having a very clear-cut definition and a framework of analysis and of assessment that's very clear-cut. Something I find concerning when we look at the approach from the federal government to assess the linguistic vitality of communities, that is essential, of course. If we look right at the beginning of the law on official languages, before that it was mother tongue, people's mother tongue, and then the usage language at home. And as there was a decline of French, we brought out the first official language spoken, which in the end really widens the definition of the language itself and beefs up the figures. And then we've brought out in 2019, we came out with the indicator for potential demand, which beefs up the figures even more. And so we're talking about people who are not necessarily making a request. But so rather than changing the criteria, so it's the number of people that justifies they have to justify that they're in greatest numbers as possible. But the federal situation or system has changed the indicators to be able to show that French speakers outside of Quebec are in greater numbers. But is that really the case? And it gives a bias to the data, really. And it means that, look, people look at things and say, look, there's an increase in the number of Francophones. But I think it would be really important to have very precise assessment criteria rather than playing with the different criteria and giving a bias to the real figures, maybe dropping the necessary criteria to have services in French or access to law services in French in Quebec. And maybe just keep these figures real so we have a real idea of the situation. rather, and not, encouraging a legitimate action from the government because by twisting the figures. I don't know what you think about it. We have 45 seconds left. Well, this brings up to the purpose of the law. It's the principle of equal reality, and that's the one that has to be looked at in depth and analyzed based on a systematic, full picture on each subject. And without this masterpiece at the center of our thought process, there will not be sustainable progress in this field. Now, for access in justice or legal services in French, you said that you had suggestions to put in place more concrete measures. We have 15 seconds, so a very quick answer, please. I apologize once again. The importance of the timelines. We need consultation process and timelines, and the public documents need to be public. We've held consultations, and I'm still waiting for the results from these consultation processes. They disappear into a sort of black hole, it seems. And to the question of the calendars and the language for the public documents, well, those are the first two elements, and we've already talked about yield indicators, but there's also the importance on the part of groups that and we're requesting the ministry to have consultations. It's not just in one direction. Very clearly, we've got in touch with government institutions and departments, and we should be able to have these consultation process. We know where our interests lie, and often we know where the important files are as well. Thank you very much. And I have to cut you off. I'm sorry. Thank you, Mr. Beaulieu. Dear colleagues, we have 22 minutes left to finish this meeting. Then this is the second round. Well, the second round of discussions is 22 minutes if we really stick to the time. So I'm really asking you to help, and I'm asking our witnesses to be very precise and to stop when we reach the time that we have. I'm now handing the floor to Mr. Gill for 5 minutes, please.
Mr. Gill, 5 minutes.
FCCF, thank you for coming here today to this committee. My question is, the regulations use vague terms such as positive measures, vitality, and negative impacts, but do not define them. From your perspective, does this lack of precision provide sufficient guidance for federal institutions, and would clear definitions improve consistency? Anyone?
Donc, je vous permettrai de...
I'll answer in French if you don't mind. So we can take several examples. One of the terms
B
in 41(7)(b), the federal institutions must mitigate negative impacts from the structural decisions. So what does that mean, structural decisions? So we have to guide the civil servant who is applying the law by defining things, for instance, like what sort of a decision is going to fall under this law, without being specific. But let's say if a federal institution creates a new program, or abolishes a new program, or changes or modifies something to do with financing, for instance. These sorts of decisions will have to be looked at through the lens of paragraph 8 of the law, and when it comes to dialogue and consultations. So these kinds of specificities should be part of the regulation.
Question. Previous witnesses have said that very little progress has been made since Bill C-13 was adopted, and the departmental approaches seem to have remained largely the same. Do you agree with this, that assertion?
Madame.
I'll also answer in French, if you don't mind. Yes, go ahead, Mr. Rémillard. Yes, absolutely. It's what we saw in the legislative sector. We saw very few changes, except a number of consultations. There are more consultations than previously, but in terms of concrete changes after the consultations, very little. Except in some cases, we had the consultations and we still don't have the results. So I don't know what happened with these consultations. So the biggest change, and well, you know, civil servants, one of the things we noted at any rate was that there might be a civil servant here or there that might take an initiative, but not in a systemic way. It's just the status quo mostly, except for the number of consultations.
Peut-être juste rajouter que finalement,
I might add that we've been working much harder since the new law was adopted because of the number of consultations, as was said, but it yielded very few results. And I think that this brings us back to how important it is to take advantage of this regulation project to make, for instance, establish clear definitions and to look exactly at accountability and to make sure that how these consultations that we carried out have influenced policies and programs. And we have to feel that the work that we have presented on behalf of our communities have led to programs and policies that take into account our realities.
Madam Engineer, experience, do you believe the proposed regulations are likely to produce meaningful change, or are stronger accountability and transparency mechanisms needed?
well, the short answer to that is no.
Okay, thank you.
I think if this regulation project had put into practice what we're asking to be in it, we wouldn't be sitting here saying that we need to review it. So,
thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Gill. Je passe la parole maintenant à Madame Chenette pour 5 minutes.
I am now giving the floor to Madame Chenette, 5 minutes. Hello, everyone, and hello to all of our experts. And it's always very important to understand realities, of course. And I hear this plea that you are making to be truly and well heard during consultations. I'm trying to find some concrete information here, but at the same time, I want to understand, I understand that it is quite complex to work with various ministries and departments, whether it's immigration, defense, or anything else. So when we're talking about health, what we need, and I see in culture, they say this is what we need, etc. But when you put all of this together, it all of a sudden becomes a little bit nebulous, a very long grocery list. And so people are going to spend a lot of time justifying themselves rather than acting. So how can we make this a concrete reality? So I've heard other experts, and we've talked about the promotion of vitality, the framework of vitality, which Madame Cadieux said was essential. If can we then put indicators quickly? So we can say, okay, so here is everybody who is in this group, because it's saying culture, we've managed to get further ahead than in other sectors. And then we can say, so this becomes unavoidable. And then and then we can look at the Sex Plus analysis that can be carried out with the different ministries. And we can carry this out in order to have actual tangible data. So I would like to know what you have to say on this, sir. Madame Cadieux or Madame Présidente.
Alors, oui, je pense que c'était un de nos espoirs les plus importants.
Yes, I think that's one of our biggest hopes that we had with of the Modernized Act. We wanted to use the expertise that it already has on surveillance and accountability mechanisms, because in the experience that we'd had in the previous years, this was not something that we were really able to measure properly, so that for the government, it was important to attach certain conditions to be met, and we can therefore better describe the impact and the effect of the various expertises that we were making for the durable development and sustainability of our communities. So I support exactly what you've said. You've talked about a framework of accountability and different indicators and with measurable progress, because how else we can justify asking for more financing for communities that are in decline. So for Francophones, and I'm not teaching you anything, they're not monolithic living in small communities. Their challenges are their own, and it depends on the cultural, economic, and context that they happen to be in, which province they happen to be in. So like we have said, we need different kind of differentiated analysis, and we have developed this in the university environment, and we have evoked this in with the CRTC, the renewal of licenses for Radio Canada, because it seems to me that it is important to look at things through this lens when it comes to language, and all of this accountability needs to be more detailed in the draft bill. Another aspect that is very practical in nature, you said, Mr. Rémillard, you said that we have to look at all of the different steps between the different levels of government, and we have to have this capacity to have something really concrete. But federal provincial agreements are carried out in many different departments. So how do we get something concrete? But isn't the data supposed to be there in order to inspire the province to respect this? You have 30 seconds. Yes. There are certain areas that are more of a priority than others. For instance, legal aid. And I've mentioned this. For us, we consider this very important. For access to justice for minority communities, national defense, very important for the promotion of French in Canada, but perhaps less so than other areas, especially when we're talking about the vitality of official language communities. So there might be a marriage to be had between the various obligations and the various priorities that exist. And there are two elements in 41. I'm sorry, I have to cut you off. I'm really sorry. I apologize. I'm now giving the floor to Mr. Beaulieu, 2.5 minutes. So because it is in the Act, very specifically, it is perhaps already contained within your recommendations, I'm not sure, but that each organism, each organization, each program that is federal, if it has to do with culture, should be subjected to an evaluation and to look at all of the different contributions
Puis à partir de là,
for the various organizations outside of Quebec, and there could be an increase so that we could follow specifically. Is that already part of your recommendations? Could you send those recommendations to us? Because it seems quite logical, because it comes from the Act itself. And Mr. Rémillard, you have said several times that there are systemic challenges to the lack of jurists and lawyers and legal personnel that is bilingual. Is there anything that you could recommend to integrate within the regulation? Yes, when we're talking about data, and research, of course, is very important in order to have evidence and have evidence-based data. There are obligations under Part 7, and I think in certain cases, certain resources could be used. In some cases, they already exist. In some other cases, a gap needs to be filled. But we're not starting from zero, but it could be integrated within a regulation. And we could create objectives that are clear and measurable in order to see if there's any progress been made or not. 45 seconds.
à la justice en français.
Would you say that access to justice in French outside of Quebec is more or less accessible, or are there enormous challenges in order to access it? Once again, there's huge differences between one region and another. It depends on the magistrature. It depends on the number of experts and different ministries. Huge differences between a region and another, and a province and another. It depends on the province and the territory. There's certainly some work to be done in that respect. And in the justice system, there's also there's a community side, but we also have to work with whether it's a territory or a province and a whole apparatus. So it's quite specific when we're talking about access to justice. So you've got on one hand the community aspect, and then you have the administration of justice, which is provincial or territorial. Thank you very much. Your time is up. I'm now giving the floor to Mr. Bélanger. 5 minutes. Hello. So the official languages mandate is to promote and protect French language in a minority situation. Since 2023, we see the intention is definitely there. And arts and culture are essential for the development of French. But you have said that the execution is lacking and we need to do analysis and research. My question, are there statistics, data, and research to show in order to carry this out? And is it available, or if it is available, whose job is it to analyze all of this to create a plan? Let's say if I put on my hat as a dad, you always need a plan in order to obtain something. You have to have a goal, and you have to have a goal that is measurable. So whose job is it to do that? The official languages action plan is something we all have in common, and normally we listen very closely to the development of our communities and structure support within it for the various communities. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. I might help out Manon when it comes to data, culture data. In the last 25 years, we've developed a relationship with our collaborative partners, which are the NFB, the Arts Council of Canada, National Arts Centre, Radio Canada, CBC, and others. And we have started working on data collection, and we agreed on certain kinds of data that we are gathering and the other organizations are gathering. I must say that we haven't advanced enough in our plan because we're working on this together, but that is exactly what it is we need in order to find out where exactly we're at, where the gaps are, and what sort of measures could help us to correct issues. Where we have more problems, paradoxically, is, for instance, trying to get data from the support programs for the OLA and what part of financing is given to arts and culture. What's the percentage? We don't have a very clear idea of what that is. So yes, of course, data is essential. And in order to make the link with your study here and the draft, I have to say that how to get positive results is first of all to get data in order to understand where the issues are and to figure out what measures can be put into place in order to correct and rectify the situation. My next question has to do with financing. We want to have a plan, we want to have a goal, we need a certain amount of money to reach that plan and that goal. So financial support, according to you, could be improved. And we know that money is transferred to the provinces, and there are intentions, and to reach a goal, it takes time. Oh, so let's say that you have financing that is guaranteed to, I don't know, 2027, 2028. So in order to accomplish something of that size or that magnitude, it does take a long time. So So the priority for the next plan of action is the same one as the previous one. And we need base financing for our organization. They need pluri-annual financing that they can count on. And I remind you that the organizations that are part of our organization in all provinces and territories outside of Quebec play an essential role. Without them, there is no development, artistic development, whether it's domestic or international. So these elements are absolutely essential. Thank you. 20 seconds? No, that was all. Thank you, Mr. Bélanger. So I'm now giving the floor to Mr. Deschênes-Thériault, 5 minutes. So Mr. Poliquin and Mr. Rémillard mentioned this. You've talked about the guiding principle of the modernization of the Act is substantive equality. So what does that mean for you to advance towards substantive equality? How do we define it and establish its progression? I'm sure Mr. Poliquin will be able to add his own details. I think that part of what we can measure in terms of progress would be the use of French. One of the goals, and of course, is to increase the number of Francophone people. Would the French also be used more in public? These are all elements that we can at least partially quantify, but it is quantifiable. But when we talk about indicators, it is these performance indicators that will tell us whether there was progress or no progress. I don't know if I'm answering your question or not. Do you have anything else to add, Mr. Poliquin? Professor Léger, who spoke a little early on, he said that true equality is results, not treatment. So in order to get true equality or substantive equality, for the minority communities and French-speaking minority is something that responds to their particular needs. So in order to get substantive equality, we have to take into account what is proper to that community, and that's already in the Act. But in order to link up to what Maître Rémillard said, we have to look at the various performance indicators that allow us to evaluate the needs of each community. So the organization here is looking at the use of French, mobility of French, and looking at a whole bunch of different recommendations of the kind which we find in Madame Cardinal's publications that Madame Cadieux mentioned a little while ago. So, Madam Junot, what does this look like, robust participation on the law? And do you have any examples on the issues that have to do with arts and cultures in federal programs that could be rectified by a better application and support of here? Yes.
Well, I think that culture isn't an exception. In this case, the regulation of Part 7 should really take the time to define what is a positive measure, what is an activity of dialogue and consultation, and when one should be used rather than the other, and to define supervisory mechanisms, oversight mechanisms. I think if all of this is well settled and organized, we, the community, will be able to use this to then set or implement these dialogues, get our needs known, and ask for the adaptations to progress towards the equality we are seeking. If on this level we need the cultural sector, we need the same model, the same processes, the same definitions and criteria, and we will be able to apply this to various various stakeholders in the cultural sector or the Ministry of Education, because of course in the sector of arts and culture we have projects that could contribute to all of this. And this brings us back to recommendations that we make for the whole regulation that will serve us well if we use it appropriately and put it into application. 20 seconds. I'm going to make the most to wish you a very good summit on artistic education, the first one that's happening this week in Ottawa. So presented by the FCCF, and I'm delighted to I await the results of it with delight. Thank you. In the name of the members of Parliament and the colleagues, I would like to thank you for your witness statements. Our next meeting will be on Thursday. We will be listening during the first hour witnesses on the regulation part 7, and then during the second hour we will be listening to 2 piece of research, the research of the report on administrative and pecuniary sanctions, and the clerk will send out the version number 2 of our report just after this meeting, and the second part of the meeting will be dedicated to drafting on the report for part 7. Lucy, our analyst researcher, will probably send you tomorrow a list of questions that we can think about and that will guide our discussions. Are you all happy with that? Mr. Goodell? Could we have an answer on the question that I asked right at the beginning of the committee meeting between now and Thursday? Will you send out that request? Yes, we certainly will. No doubt. I don't know if we'll have an answer by then, but we will do as best we can, of course. Thank you very much. I close this session.